Sabrina Brooks was known for her beauty and charm, qualities that had once captivated her husband, Robert. Their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, a perfect match that everyone admired. But the arrival of Robert's elderly mother, Miriam, into their home set off a chain of events that would end in unspeakable horror. Miriam was a frail but spirited woman, loved by her son and cherished by those who knew her. When Robert decided to bring her to live with them, he believed it was the right thing to do, a way to care for her in her twilight years. Sabrina, however, saw it differently. She viewed Miriam as an intruder, a threat to her domestic bliss. As tensions escalated, Sabrina's resentment turned to desperation. In a moment of madness, she concocted a deadly plan to rid herself of the woman she blamed for her misery. What followed was a chilling tale of premeditated murder, a crime that would leave an indelible mark on all who were touched by it. Sabrina and Robert's relationship began like a whirlwind romance. They met at a friend's wedding, where Robert, a successful architect, was immediately smitten by Sabrina's grace and vivacity. She worked as a freelance product photographer, and her creative spirit matched well with Robert's structured approach to life. After a brief courtship, they married and settled into a beautiful home on the outskirts of town. Miriam Brooks had lived a full life. Widowed for nearly a decade, she maintained her independence in a modest house in town. Her health had begun to decline, and Robert, ever the dutiful son, felt it was his responsibility to care for her. Miriam had always been a nurturing presence in Robert's life, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone. Initially, Sabrina and Miriam got along well enough. Miriam was polite and grateful, and Sabrina, though slightly apprehensive, made an effort to welcome her mother-in-law. But as weeks turned into months, the strain of their living arrangement began to show. Miriam's constant presence disrupted the couple's privacy and routine, and Sabrina felt increasingly sidelined in her own home. Robert, caught between his wife and his mother, tried to balance their needs. He was patient and kind, hoping that time would ease the tension. But Sabrina's discontent only grew. She confided in her friends about the stress she was under, seeking advice on how to cope. Some suggested patience, while others hinted that Robert's loyalty to his mother might always overshadow his marriage. The situation worsened as Miriam's health declined further. She required more care and attention, which fell primarily on Sabrina during the day while Robert was at work. The constant demands wore on her, leading to frequent arguments with Robert. He, in turn, became defensive and frustrated, unable to understand why Sabrina couldn't be more accommodating. Sabrina's resentment festered, turning into a simmering rage. She felt trapped, her life overshadowed by an elderly woman who seemed to sap all the joy from her marriage. As her desperation grew, Sabrina's thoughts took a darker turn. She began to entertain the idea of a life without Miriam, envisioning the return of her once idyllic marriage. It was in these moments of bitterness and despair that the seeds of her deadly plan were sown. Robert's decision to bring Miriam into their home was not made lightly. He had seen his mother's health decline and knew she needed more support than he could provide from a distance. After long discussions with Sabrina, he convinced her that it was the best solution. Reluctantly, Sabrina agreed, though she harbored reservations about the impact on their marriage. The day Miriam moved in, Robert and Sabrina prepared a guest room with care. Robert was excited to have his mother close, and Sabrina, though uneasy, wanted to support her husband's decision. Miriam arrived with a few suitcases and a warm smile, grateful for her son's hospitality. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed manageable. Miriam was polite and tried not to impose. She kept to her room most of the time, reading or knitting, and joined the couple for meals and occasional outings. Robert was relieved to see his mother settled and safe, but Sabrina began to feel the strain almost immediately. Miriam's presence altered the dynamics of the household. Dinner conversations that once flowed easily between Sabrina and Robert now included Miriam's comments and stories. Robert's attention was divided, and Sabrina found herself missing the intimacy they once shared. The subtle shifts in their relationship gnawed at her, creating an undercurrent of resentment. The first major conflict arose over household routines. Miriam, accustomed to her way of doing things, often interfered with Sabrina's established methods. She would rearrange the kitchen, critique Sabrina's cooking, or offer unsolicited advice on housekeeping. Sabrina, who prided herself on running an efficient home, felt undermined and disrespected. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where Miriam had criticized Sabrina's choice of dessert, the couple had a heated argument. Robert, exhausted from work and the constant tension, defended his mother, insisting that Sabrina was overreacting. Sabrina, feeling betrayed and isolated, lashed out, accusing Robert of always taking his mother's side. The arguments became more frequent. Robert, torn between his love for his wife and his duty to his mother, struggled to keep the peace. He tried to mediate, suggesting compromises and asking both women to be more understanding. But the underlying issues remained unresolved, and the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Sabrina's resentment deepened as she felt increasingly trapped in a situation she had never wanted. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, and she confided in a few about the constant stress she was under. Some offered sympathy, others advised her to stand her ground, but none could offer a solution that seemed viable. As the days turned into weeks, the initial harmony gave way to a persistent tension that permeated every aspect of their lives. The once warm and inviting home became a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering anger. Sabrina's frustration reached a boiling point, and she began to fantasize about drastic measures to reclaim her life. Little did she know, those dark thoughts would soon manifest into a chilling reality. The tension in the Brooks household continued to rise, seeping into every corner of their lives. Miriam, oblivious to the depth of Sabrina's resentment, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She believed that with time things would improve, but Sabrina's patience was wearing thin, and her anger became harder to conceal. One morning, Sabrina discovered that Miriam had reorganized the pantry. What seemed like a minor inconvenience to Robert felt like a personal affront to Sabrina. She stormed into the living room where Miriam was sitting, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "You can't just come in here and change everything. This is my house." Miriam looked up, startled. "I was only trying to help, dear. I didn't mean to upset you. It's not help when it's done without asking. You're just making things harder." Robert walked in just as Sabrina's voice rose, and he quickly stepped between them. "Sabrina, please calm down. She's just trying to help." Sabrina shot him a look of pure frustration. "You always take her side, Robert. I'm the one who has to deal with this every day." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't about sides. We're a family. We need to work together." Despite Robert's attempts to mediate, the rift between Sabrina and Miriam grew wider. Sabrina started avoiding Miriam as much as possible, retreating to her studio to work on her graphic design projects. She found solace in her work, a temporary escape from the constant strain at home. But the escape was fleeting. Every time she left her studio, she was reminded of Miriam's presence. The small irritations accumulated, each one adding to the weight of her resentment. She began to dread coming home, the once safe haven now a source of continuous stress. Friends noticed the change in Sabrina. She became more withdrawn, her usual vibrant personality overshadowed by a constant undercurrent of tension. During a coffee outing with her close friend Julia, Sabrina finally opened up about the depth of her frustration. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Julia. She's everywhere all the time. It's like I'm living with a stranger in my own home." Julia listened sympathetically. "Have you talked to Robert about how you feel?" Sabrina let out a bitter laugh. "Talked? All we do is argue about her. He doesn't see how much it's affecting me. He just wants to keep the peace." Julia reached out and squeezed Sabrina's hand. "Maybe you need to take some time for yourself. Get away for a bit. Clear your head." Sabrina nodded, but deep down she knew that a temporary escape wouldn't solve her problems. The constant presence of Miriam in her home felt like a prison sentence, one she couldn't escape from. Her thoughts grew darker, and she began to entertain ideas she had once considered unthinkable. One night, as Sabrina lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed her mind that made her shudder. What if Miriam wasn't here anymore? The idea lingered, gaining strength with each passing day. It was a forbidden thought, one that brought a sense of both horror and twisted relief. As the days turned into weeks, the seeds of a plan began to take root in Sabrina's mind. She started researching methods to make someone ill, initially out of morbid curiosity. But the more she read, the more the idea of poisoning Miriam seemed like a viable solution to her predicament. It would be quick, discreet, and if done correctly, could appear as a natural death. Sabrina's desperation clouded her judgment. She convinced herself that this was the only way to regain control of her life and salvage her marriage. The dark thoughts that had once seemed so alien now felt like a lifeline. Little did she know this decision would lead her down a path of no return, with consequences far beyond her darkest imaginings. Sabrina's desperation reached its peak as she found herself more isolated and overwhelmed by the day. The once loving and harmonious relationship with Robert now felt like a distant memory, replaced by constant arguments and mutual resentment. She began to see Miriam not as an innocent elderly woman, but as the embodiment of all her marital problems. Confiding in friends became a regular outlet for Sabrina's frustration. During a particularly emotional conversation with her friend Lisa, Sabrina's true feelings came to the surface. "I can't do this anymore, Lisa. Every day is a battle. I feel like I'm losing myself." Lisa looked concerned. "You need to find a way to cope, Sabrina. Maybe you should see a therapist or take some time away." Sabrina shook her head. "Therapy won't change anything. The problem is Miriam. As long as she's here, nothing will get better." Lisa hesitated, then spoke softly. "Have you thought about asking her to move out? Maybe she could go to a care facility where she'd get the help she needs." Sabrina's eyes darkened. "Robert would never agree to that. He's too loyal. He'd see it as abandoning her." Lisa sighed. "I'm worried about you, Sabrina. This isn't healthy. You need to do something before it's too late." Sabrina nodded absently, but her mind was already elsewhere. She had considered every possible solution and always came back to the same conclusion. Miriam had to go. The idea of poisoning her mother-in-law, once a fleeting thought, now seemed like the only viable option. Sabrina began to meticulously plan Miriam's demise. She spent hours researching poisons, focusing on substances that would be difficult to detect. Her background in graphic design gave her an eye for detail, and she applied this skill to her dark new project. She discovered that certain plants, when ingested in small doses over time, could cause symptoms resembling a natural illness. With a plan in place, Sabrina started the next phase, obtaining the poison. She chose aconite, a potent toxin found in monkshood plants. It was a risky choice, but one that could be easily masked in food. She ordered the seeds online, ensuring they were delivered to a friend's address to avoid suspicion. The seeds arrived a few days later, and Sabrina carefully cultivated them in a hidden corner of her garden. She tended to them with a mixture of dread and determination, knowing that each day brought her closer to executing her plan. The process took weeks, during which the tension in the house continued to escalate. Miriam's health, already fragile, began to show signs of further decline. She frequently complained of stomach pains and nausea, symptoms that Sabrina dismissed with a feigned concern. Robert, ever the devoted son, grew increasingly worried, suggesting doctor visits and tests to determine the cause. Sabrina played her part well, expressing appropriate levels of worry and support. She accompanied Miriam to the doctor, reassuring Robert that they were doing everything possible. The doctors attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing health conditions, prescribing medications that did little to alleviate her suffering. The final stage of Sabrina's plan required careful timing. She waited for a day when Robert would be away for an extended period, ensuring she had the house to herself. She prepared a special meal for Miriam, infusing it with a small amount of aconite. The dose was low enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but high enough to exacerbate Miriam's symptoms. As Miriam ate the meal, Sabrina watched her with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. She felt a twisted sense of relief, believing that she was finally taking control of her life. But the act also brought a deep sense of guilt, one that gnawed at her even as she reassured herself that this was the only way. In the days that followed, Miriam's condition worsened. She grew weaker and more lethargic, her complaints of pain more frequent. Robert was beside himself with worry, while Sabrina maintained her facade of concern. The poison was doing its job, slowly but surely, and Sabrina felt both triumphant and terrified at the prospect of what she had set in motion. Sabrina's meticulous planning reached its final stages as she prepared to carry out the poisoning. The growing tension and escalating arguments with Robert only fueled her resolve. She was convinced that eliminating Miriam was the only way to restore harmony to her marriage and reclaim her life. Acquiring the aconite seeds had been a nerve-wracking process. Sabrina knew the risks involved in handling such a potent toxin, but desperation had clouded her judgment. She carefully cultivated the plants, watching them grow with a mix of dread and determination. Each step brought her closer to the point of no return. Sabrina spent hours in her studio, not working on her usual graphic design projects, but refining her plan. She researched the effects of aconite, ensuring she understood the symptoms it would produce. Vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain were common, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a severe but natural illness in an elderly woman like Miriam. Timing was crucial. Sabrina needed to administer the poison in such a way that it would slowly deteriorate Miriam's health, making her death appear as a natural progression of her existing ailments. She decided to mix small amounts of the aconite into Miriam's food over several weeks, gradually increasing the dosage. Sabrina's first attempt was a simple broth. She chose a day when Robert was working late, giving her the time and privacy she needed. Miriam, unaware of the sinister intent behind the meal, ate the broth without suspicion. Sabrina watched her carefully, noting any signs of discomfort. In the days that followed, Miriam began to complain more frequently of stomach pains and nausea. Sabrina played the concerned daughter-in-law, offering comfort and suggesting they visit the doctor. Robert, seeing Sabrina's apparent dedication, was grateful and less inclined to suspect any foul play. Sabrina continued to administer the poison, each dose carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. She alternated the methods of delivery, sometimes mixing it into tea, other times blending it into soups or casseroles. Each meal brought Miriam closer to the brink, her health steadily declining. Despite her outward calm, Sabrina was racked with guilt and fear. The enormity of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she convinced herself that this was the only solution. She reminded herself of the life she would regain once Miriam was gone, a life free from the constant strain and arguments. Robert's increasing concern for his mother's health provided Sabrina with the perfect cover. He arranged for multiple doctor visits, each one yielding no definitive answers. The medical professionals attributed Miriam's symptoms to her age and existing conditions, prescribing medications that did little to help. Sabrina's plan seemed to be working flawlessly. Miriam's decline was gradual, and the doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play. Sabrina's meticulous research and careful administration of the poison ensured that Miriam's symptoms matched those of a natural illness. The final dose was administered on a particularly stressful day. Robert had left for an extended business trip, leaving Sabrina and Miriam alone in the house. It was the perfect opportunity to deliver the fatal dose of aconite without immediate suspicion. The house felt unnaturally quiet, a silence that seemed to echo Sabrina's racing thoughts. Sabrina prepared Miriam's favorite soup, a creamy mushroom bisque. She measured the aconite carefully, her hand steady despite the turmoil inside her. This was it. There was no turning back. The poison, now finely ground and nearly invisible, was mixed into the soup with methodical precision. As she carried the bowl to the dining table, Sabrina forced a smile. "Lunch is ready, Miriam. I made your favorite." Miriam, looking frailer than ever, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, dear. You're so kind." Sabrina felt a pang of guilt but quickly suppressed it. She watched as Miriam slowly ate the soup, each spoonful bringing her closer to the end. The meal progressed in a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Miriam's labored breathing. As the poison took effect, Miriam's discomfort became evident. She clutched her stomach, her face contorted in pain. Sabrina maintained her facade of concern, suggesting they call a doctor. But the symptoms progressed rapidly, and soon Miriam was struggling to breathe. Sabrina dialed 911, her voice filled with feigned panic. "My mother-in-law is very ill. Please send an ambulance quickly." The paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Miriam in severe distress. They rushed her to the hospital, with Sabrina following closely behind. In the sterile confines of the emergency room, Sabrina watched as the doctors and nurses worked frantically to save Miriam. She maintained her act, shedding tears and expressing worry, but inside she felt a grim sense of relief. Despite their efforts, Miriam's condition deteriorated rapidly. The poison had done its job, and within hours Miriam passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from her existing health issues, exacerbated by her age. The doctors saw no reason to suspect foul play, and Sabrina's plan seemed to have succeeded perfectly. Robert was devastated when he received the news. He returned home immediately, shattered by the loss of his mother. Sabrina played the supportive wife, comforting him through his grief while hiding the dark truth. The funeral was a somber affair, with friends and family gathering to pay their respects. Sabrina's performance was flawless, her sorrow appearing genuine to all who observed, but the guilt gnawed at her. Each time Robert spoke of his mother's kindness and strength, Sabrina felt a stab of remorse. She had taken an innocent life, driven by desperation and resentment. The relief she had expected was overshadowed by the weight of her actions. She had crossed a line and there was no going back. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Robert threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from his grief. Sabrina, meanwhile, tried to resume her usual routines, but the shadow of her crime loomed large. She found it difficult to concentrate on her graphic design projects, her mind constantly replaying the events of that fateful day. Her friends noticed the change in her demeanor, but Sabrina attributed it to the stress of Miriam's death and the strain on her marriage. She continued to put on a brave face, maintaining the facade of a grieving daughter-in-law, but inside she was falling apart. One night, as she lay in bed beside Robert, the enormity of her actions hit her with full force. She had committed murder, taken a life to solve her problems, and now she had to live with the consequences. The thought was overwhelming, and Sabrina found herself trembling with a mix of fear and regret. Robert, sensing her distress, reached out to comfort her. But deep down, she knew that the truth could not remain hidden forever. The seeds of her crime were planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. Sabrina's carefully constructed world was built on a foundation of lies, and as the days passed, she began to realize that the price of her actions would be far greater than she had ever imagined. In the aftermath of Miriam's death, life in the Brooks household settled into a somber routine. Robert's grief was palpable, and Sabrina did her best to support him, all the while masking her own turmoil. She believed she had successfully concealed her crime, but the peace she longed for remained elusive. Little did she know, the real consequences of her actions were about to unfold. The initial investigation into Miriam's death was routine. The doctors attributed her passing to natural causes, given her age and existing health conditions. However, a nurse who had been present during Miriam's final hours noticed something odd. The rapid progression of her symptoms seemed unusual, even for someone of her age. The nurse, Emma Collins, mentioned her concerns to the attending physician, Dr. Alan Harris. Emma was experienced and meticulous, not one to jump to conclusions. Dr. Harris, although initially dismissive, agreed to review Miriam's case notes. Upon closer inspection, he too found the rapid deterioration puzzling. They decided to conduct a more thorough autopsy, just to be sure. The autopsy revealed traces of a toxin in Miriam's system, something that should not have been there. Dr. Harris immediately alerted the authorities, and the case was escalated to the Greenwood Police Department. Detective Laura Rogan was assigned to lead the investigation. Detective Rogan was a seasoned investigator, with a keen eye for detail. She began by interviewing the medical staff who had attended to Miriam, gathering information about her symptoms and the timeline of her decline. The discovery of the toxin raised alarm bells, and Rogan knew this was no ordinary case. Next, Rogan turned her attention to the Brooks household. She interviewed Robert first, who was devastated by the news of a potential foul play. His genuine shock and grief were evident, and Rogan quickly ruled him out as a suspect. Sabrina, however, presented a more complex picture. Sabrina was composed during the interview, expressing appropriate levels of sadness and concern. But Rogan sensed something was off. There was a guardedness in Sabrina's demeanor, a subtle tension that didn't sit right. Rogan had seen it before, the signs of someone hiding something. Sabrina, when questioned about Miriam's health, reiterated the doctor's findings. She played the role of the caring daughter-in-law, describing how she had tried to make Miriam comfortable and had taken her to the doctor multiple times. But her story seemed rehearsed, and Rogan made a mental note to dig deeper. The detectives decided to search the Brooks house, focusing on areas where they might find evidence of poison. Sabrina grew increasingly anxious as they combed through the kitchen, the garden, and her studio. She tried to maintain her composure, but the stress was evident in her trembling hands and forced calm. In the garden, the detectives found a small patch of monkshood plants, the source of aconite. Rogan's suspicions grew. She sent samples to the lab for analysis, and the results confirmed the presence of aconite, the same toxin found in Miriam's system. The breakthrough came when the detectives discovered Sabrina's internet search history. Her computer revealed extensive research on poisons, specifically aconite, and methods of administering it. The evidence was damning, painting a clear picture of premeditated murder. Rogan confronted Sabrina with the findings. In the face of irrefutable evidence, Sabrina broke down. The facade crumbled, and she confessed to the crime, her voice filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. She explained how the strain of living with Miriam had driven her to commit the unthinkable, believing it was the only way to save her marriage. The confession shocked Robert to his core. The woman he loved, The woman he thought he knew had murdered his mother. His world shattered, and he struggled to comprehend the depth of Sabrina's betrayal. The couple's friends and family were equally stunned, unable to reconcile the image of the charming, creative Sabrina with that of a cold-blooded killer. Sabrina's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The trial was set to begin 3 months after Sabrina's arrest. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Reed, presented a compelling case built on the extensive evidence gathered by Detective Rogan and her team. The jury deliberated for several days, weighing the evidence and testimonies presented. The community held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When the jury finally returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Sabrina was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence reflected the severity of her crime, while also acknowledging the mitigating circumstances presented by the defense. For Robert, the verdict brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Justice had been served, but the scars left by Sabrina's actions would never fully heal. The trial's conclusion marked the end of a tragic chapter for the Brooks family. Robert, now faced with the task of rebuilding his life, decided to leave Greenwood. The town, once a place of happy memories, had become a constant reminder of his loss. He moved to a different city, seeking a fresh start and hoping to find some semblance of peace. In the end, the Brooks family saga served as a stark reminder of the destructive power of desperation and the importance of compassion, understanding, and mental health support. It was a story that underscored the fragile nature of human relationships and the devastating consequences that could arise when those bonds were pushed to their breaking point.